For this week, we will spend a little bit of time looking at the Karen Seccombe book, So You Think I Drive a Cadillac. This is intended to be a ancillary textbook for you, the day text being the primary text, but what Seccombe does in her book is really kind of give you a good picture of what it's like to be a recipient today, as well as to underscore some of the issues related to being in the system, so to speak, and the kinds of problems that individuals in that system experience not only in existing on a day-to-day basis, but also in their efforts to get off of the system and to become a regularly uh, economic contributor to society. The image we have, of course, of welfare recipients, at least much of our nation has, is of people who kind of living on the dole and who really have no ambition and really only want to kind of get handouts from the taxpayer, and to live on our largesse all the time. And certainly there is a percentage of recipients who have that kind of attitude about being on public assistance and receiving benefits from society, but the largest majority of individuals receiving benefits through our government system are there temporarily and are there because of difficult times or sometimes because of disabilities. But by and large, the popular perception of the welfare recipient is very, very wrong. Now, the interesting thing about this textbook is Seccombe talks to some of the people who really don't have motivation to get off the system, and addresses the reasons for that too, and some things that we could do, not so much in changing the welfare system or eliminating the welfare system, but within our own economic system that would be much more effective in terms of fixing that particular problem. So in this book, because it is more of a modern day kind of a look at things, we're not going to spend a lot of time in the Seccombe book in the first month or so of this class, but sometime 4 or 5 weeks down the road, we'll pick this text up after we've read this first chapter here. We'll pick this text up and we'll then begin to read through it week by week, to kind of build on it, so that by the end of the semester, when we're really talking about the programs that in the day text that the clients are living with in the Seccombe book, we'll have a better understanding of what those programs really do for our clients out there. And so in the first chapter, she's really just kind of laying a foundation for some ways to think about this problem. And she talks about different frameworks that we have that we tend to adopt in looking at problems, and a couple of different perspectives that she encourages you to recognize and understand. First is the critical perspective. Basically, what Seccombe is telling us in this chapter is that we do have a tendency to internalize the ideologies of the status quo. The things that we've been told by our parents, or the things we hear in the news around us. And so we kind of accept and integrate that and begin to believe these things without really examining them. And so she says that a critical perspective is one of those things you need to have in working through this book, is to really not allow yourself to just accept the status quo ideology, but rather to, even though it is probably internalized in you and me as well, that we really pull that out and examine it. And this is one of the things that this book, I think, is challenging us to do. She gives a good example of status quo ideologies, something that Ronald Reagan said when he was president, midway through his administration, where he described welfare as a narcotic and a subtle destroyer of the human spirit, and so this put a good negative stamp on that, on the whole notion of welfare and receiving benefits and things, which really, welfare isn't the bad thing in the lives of these individuals, and you'll see this as we read through this book later on. Another perspective that she uses, and both she and Day, in fact, if you haven't noticed, are right from a feminist perspective, and this is something that will be important for you to be able to be familiar with. The feminist perspective essentially indicates that women have certain experiences. Well, in this particular case, at least in this book, that women have certain experiences because society is organized by sex and gender. In a patriarchal society, of course, women tend to have a disability, so to speak, I think, in the economic system just to begin with. And makes a few comments that I think are worth keeping in mind. That many women are simply one man away or one crisis away from welfare themselves. That in fact many women depend on men to make their ends meet and to provide for their children. And then if that man left, they would have no choice but to go into the welfare system. Or those who are single parents, oftentimes just one major crisis can put you there. It's sort of the thing that we talk about, living paycheck to paycheck, and particularly working women, most of them that have children at least are often living paycheck to paycheck. They have no opportunity to develop any kind of a savings or to have other assets that they can turn to. Women earn about 3/4 of men's earnings and are more than twice as likely to earn only the minimum wage in a job. Now, these are things that are worth keeping in mind when we talk about welfare to work programs and the kinds of jobs that women wind up working in. And there'll be a lot more about that as we work through this book. She identifies 4 themes that in this text that she thinks is something that we can draw from as we approach this study, and 4 things to keep in mind. And one theme, she says, is that affluent women have more in common with poor women than they probably realize and may care to know. That really public assistance, welfare benefits, it isn't so much about rich versus poor as it is a woman's issue. Phyllis Day also says in her text that poverty is a women's issue. And as a male, when I first was exposed to that idea many, many years ago, I had a negative reaction to that because I felt there were plenty of poor men out there. But in fact, when you look at the statistics, women are the ones that live in poverty much more and are the ones who are generally burdened with children, work in low-wage jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's really very much about patriarchy and those kinds of things. And what she's saying here is that women who are better off financially have more in common with poor women than they don't have in common. And so that's one theme to keep in mind. Secondly, the current reforms in the system are predicated on changing assumptions about appropriate women's roles within the marketplace and within the family, and beliefs that poor women enjoy the free ride they get from the welfare system at taxpayer expense. With the feminist movement in the 60s and the 70s coming more and more into fruition, there are more women in the workforce. Women are able to get jobs, more women in universities and those kinds of things. And philosophically, at least, women are now free to leave the home and go to work. Of course, that doesn't relieve them necessarily of being the primary childcare provider, but it does. But there are daycare centers and other such providers out there that they can use if they want to go to work. So it looks as though it's easy for women now to get by. And so the welfare recipients, the women who are on the public assistance programs, appear to be taking a free ride, and that they really have other options if they want it. Now, again, that's sort of a belief out there. That's not the fact, but it is a belief. So it's just important to keep that in mind as well. Another theme is that the real welfare problem has little to do with the welfare system at all, but instead lies in the insecurity of the low-wage workforce. That is, welfare with all its limitations does provide more security to vulnerable families than employment within the lowest tiers of our labor market. There is a lot about this theme in the later chapters in this book, and it is in some respects one of the keys to her thesis in this book, which is that we really shouldn't be attacking the welfare system. We should be working on changing the economic system. That if you have a job at minimum wage, or at that level, at entry level of the workforce, that you don't have the security that you would have in the public assistance program for yourself and your children in terms of many other things, and so including predictable income. So this is a theme again that you often hear the debate that it's too comfortable on welfare. Well, it's not really comfortable on welfare, but the sad state of affairs is that when women go to work, they find that welfare was more comfortable than for many respects, and not from a selfish standpoint, but from the standpoint of a parent caring for dependent children. That it was much more comfortable to be in the public assistance program, and they could be a more reliable provider of being on that program. So another theme for you to keep in mind. Finally, the fourth theme is that social policies that are designed to ameliorate poverty and human suffering will be more successful if we take into account the specific needs that poor women articulate themselves. One of the criticisms that she has of the changes in policies that have been implemented, well, really since the Reagan administration, but certainly from the Clinton administration on, is that very few people are actually talking to poor women about how these changes would affect them and what they really need. And so she believes that we need to spend more time talking and understanding the plight of the welfare recipient, so if we're going to really do something to effectively change their dependency on the system. So that's what this book is about, really. Brief history, and this is something we'll touch on more in later chapters of the day text. But in 1996, Bill Clinton signed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. In doing that, he eliminated the traditional welfare program that we were familiar with since the New Deal, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and replaced it with a program called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF. In Alaska, the version of this program is ATAP, Alaska Temporary Assistance Program. So you may have heard about ATAP and not TANF, but TANF has been the national program that funded those programs. And the goals of TANF in 1996 was to provide assistance to needy families, to end dependence of needy parents on government benefits. So while providing assistance, ending the dependence of the parents on the government. Now you notice the dichotomy there, that they're going to provide assistance to the families, but in the dependence of the parent, the mother. This is a thing that Day talks about in her textbook, that we focus upon the unemployed parent when we think about welfare, and instead of really realizing that most of the recipients are children who need this benefit. To prevent and reduce the incidence of out-of-wedlock pregnancies, there were certain provisions within the act that made it more difficult for pregnant teenagers to get public assistance, and if they did, that they had to be living with a responsible adult. And then also to encourage the formation and maintenance of two-parent families. Of interest is, when we talk about being on the dole and just kind of living and not doing anything for your check. Here's a process. Take a moment to look through this, what it takes to qualify or to begin to get public assistance in New York City. And while this is specific to New York City, really there aspects of this are true everywhere you go. Some of them may be not quite as intense in other places, but it isn't an easy process. Attending 2 eligibility interviews, getting fingerprinted and and 2 different locations too, and then getting fingerprinting and photographed, having a home visit, going to an orientation session, going to daily job search classes for during the 30-day eligibility determination period. All that within the first month. So she wonders if the way this program has been structured since 1996, if it's pushing people away from dependency, is it pushing them into despondency? There is a table in your textbook on the Seccombe book, pages 15 and 16, that show you the characteristics of AFDC and TANF recipients across a 10-year period of time, that I think is very interesting and is worth taking a look at. I don't really see that there's a lot of difference, and that's the interesting thing, is the individuals who, the profile of persons who were receiving assistance in 1994 pretty much remained the same in 2006 after a decade of its implementation or more. And so The TANF program had certainly served to reduce the number of people in public assistance, but I'm not sure that any one particular group benefited in any way from the new structure of that system. And Seccombe closes with a statement in this, or at least a thought in her first chapter that I think is something that is really key for you to understand when you consider what she's writing about in here. And as we talk about the development of this system, she says lifting women from poverty and eliminating them from welfare are two separate issues. That should say are two separate issues. Unfortunately, it is the latter concern that is the one that's most often addressed in welfare reform. So we really focus upon eliminating women from welfare, and that's sort of the goal of everything, when really she says we should be looking at lifting women from poverty. And that's a whole different thing to think about, how to go about doing that. We don't need to just get them off of welfare. We need to get them out of poverty. And that isn't going to be accomplished simply by changing the welfare system. So that's a brief summary of Seccombe's first chapter in her text. And if you have any questions from this, please let me know. This book, I hope, will stir up some thoughts. And again, remember to take a critical perspective on this, and to step out of those traditional assumptions we have about welfare recipients as we work through this text and through this course. And I think at the end, you may have a better understanding of who's receiving assistance and why, what the programs are like, and what we can do about it as professionals. Okay, thank you.